Hey everybody, welcome back to retrogames. So Tarek and continuing series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project. And I got a really fun video for you guys this Thursday because everyone and their uncle has been asking to see 240p direct video out of MiSTer FPGA into the RetroTink 4K to get MiSTer FPGA 4K scaled. So that's exactly what we're going to do. It's a ton of fun. We're going to go over the hardware and all of the different settings. But a big thanks to today's sponsor, MiSTer Add-ons. He brings all the hardware that you see here in this video, MiSTer-wise, and he does have a new DAC coming out soon, which I will talk about towards the end of the video, but you definitely 100% want to see something like Neo Geo in 4K off the RetroTink 4K because it's a spectacular image and there is a lot of fun to be had marrying these two things together. But let's talk about the hardware side first. Obviously, this is a dual RAM MiSTer because I do not have an analog out port. I've got 3 different MiSTers, and while you could just put the 1080p signal into HDMI in, that's really not what we want to do because that would be double scaling. We do, however, have the option to use the VGA in port across multiple different types of signals. You'll see here I have an HDMI to VGA DAC. If we take a look at that, all it is a VGA port on one end and an HDMI port on the other that allows us to take a digital signal off the HDMI port on MiSTer FPGA and on direct video mode, contact in with a VGA cable to get RGB HV or RGB sync out of the MiSTer. You'll see here on the other end, it's just a standard VGA style port. It is not called VGA, it is just a port type. And on the other end, you're going to have an HDMI cable. I will leave a link in the description below to this one, but I think you guys should wait for MiSTer Add-ons DAC because it's going to be a lot more fully featured. So basically, all you need to do to accomplish this outside of setting direct video mode to equal 1 is to connect one end of the DAC into MiSTer and connect a VGA cable into your RetroTink. Hook those two devices together, and this is how we're going to chain them up so we can get the video signal carried from MiSTer FPGA unscaled in 240p over to the RetroTink 4K. Now you could do this with an analog signal out of an analog I/O board, but direct video is also carrying data that the RetroTink 4K is going to ingest to get a lot of the decimation and crop ready for you. Just be aware it's still the early days of this. There's definitely a firmware update on the RetroTink 4K side, and there is some updates to cores that will be required in the future to get this absolutely perfect. But let's start with what we've been talking about so often on the channel now, the work in progress Nintendo 64 core from Roboter FPGA Zoom Spas. And this is running on 240p video, and you will see here that it is getting a really nice scale off the top, but we can go to an auto crop and make that a little bit bigger if we want to fill the screen. By default on MiSTer FPGA, this is not going to actually fill your entire screen. That is how the core works. You can decide to have those black borders, or you can do a full crop to make sure that the screen fills itself out. And these are choices you get to make. Generally, if I'm playing on my television at home, I'm going to leave those black bars there, and if I am capturing for YouTube, I usually fill it out because I hate the borders when you're actually watching the presentation. But as far as the video signal is concerned, this is pristine 240p RGB signal coming out of MiSTer and going into the RetroTink. Do be aware that if you want to load some profiles up, those are mostly predicated off using the SCART port. So if you select a profile and you notice that you lose your signal, that is because it's actually overridden your input and moved it over to a different one. If I take the zoom here just for fun, you're going to see that I have no signal, but interestingly, if I go to input select and I go back over to the right port and the right input, I am now in that zoom profile. So it seems like you can trick it around and you can play around with those settings, but honestly, I like dialing in things myself. You will see here those bars are now on the screen, and I'm leaving them there so you can see what this would normally look like if you took the information out of MiSTer FPGA. Because the Nintendo 64 has so many different video formats it's sending out as far as resolutions and how it actually puts the image on the screen, seeing something like this is not in any way, shape, or form an issue either on the RetroTink 4K side or the MiSTer FPGA side. It's just how things look. But as I scale and resolve just to fill that little bit of a gap and throw some scan lines on, this is an absolutely amazing image, getting 240p out of the MiSTer for Nintendo 64 and upscaling it all the way to 4K. It just looks spectacular. I can't get enough of this. Now you might notice that this is not as good of a signal as something like HDMI out, and that is just because an analog signal is never going to compete with an HDMI signal as far as absolutely carrying the most amount of data possible when it comes to a signal. Analog is great and I love it, but honestly in HDMI, this looks spectacular as well. This is just so you can get to 4K off 240p using one scaler with that analog signal, but Kirby 64 here again just looks amazing with those scan lines on top. And if you notice a little garbage at the bottom of the screen, that is just on the core. But again, you can play around with this scaling after RetroTink 4K takes the information coming over from direct video, does all the decimation and everything like that, and you can decide to play with it even more. That's the great thing about RetroTink married to the MiSTer. It does 99% of the work for you, and then you can go in and articulate the image however you feel like. But this is going to be the best looking analog signal scale that you can get out of MiSTer if you put these two things together. And that's the fun of direct video. On some cores it'll even carry more color data information, but honestly if you didn't pixel peep and I didn't tell you which ones of those were, I don't think you would ever notice. And you do have the gain as well. I do think that Nintendo 64 looks good with 1/10 of a decimal place increase on the gain. It just brings the vibrancy up a little bit more. But when you're using an analog signal, it's always going to be, in my opinion, slightly less vibrant than an HDMI signal. You could put the HDMI into the back of the RetroTink, but then you would be scaling on MiSTer NTink as well, and you would be doubling up on any latency. Now on the PlayStation 1 side, Castlevania Symphony of the Night in 4K using the 240p signal. This looks absolutely spectacular. The pixels are razor sharp. Everything in this image is just one of the best ways I've ever seen this game run, from all of the effects to everything else. Do be aware again though, I am doing a little post scaling in my nonlinear editing system, DaVinci Resolve, because this game also just leaves black bars in the top or the bottom depending on what you're doing in the game. Remember on retro systems, they would do so many different things, and you usually didn't see that when you were on an analog television because there would be overscan underneath the bezels of the TV. So sometimes when you see something you don't remember from back in the day, that is because you're using a different type of panel compared to a CRT television. But from the colors to the effects to all of the pixels to everything here in Symphony of the Night, I would say this is a 10 out of 10 perfect image coming out of the RetroTink 4K. Put this on your television in your living room and it's going to look even more spectacular. Hopefully you guys are watching this video in 4K 60. Now this is what the image looks like if we let it just go natively. You're going to see there's the bars at the top and the bottom, and they're not even centered. This is just something that hardware would do back in the day. But you'll see if we take a look over at the source, we're getting that 240p signal out, and it's being detected by the RetroTink. And because of the new updates to MiSTer FPGA, it's going to be sending data over that signal, and RetroTink 4K is going to be receiving that data to set most of things up for you. Just be aware you need to update the firmware on the RetroTink 4K, and right now this video mode and the data coming over is going to be on unstable MiSTer main. Sure, direct video has been around forever, but this data has not been merged into main as of the recording of this video. And I will definitely update this when that happens for a little bit more ease of use, but I didn't want to show you guys how to do unstable main today. But his death is here, and that vortex swirls in the background with a slight scan line over the top. Again, this just looks absolutely spectacular. The scan line takes a tiny bit of the sharpness down, blending those pixels like you would normally see them on a CRT television from back in the day. And again, this is a gorgeous look all going on between the MiSTer FPGA and the RetroTink 4K. But let's move over to something 3D on the PlayStation 1 side, because I'm trying to mix this up between 2D and 3D sources. Crash Bandicoot here looks absolutely spectacular on RetroTink 4K. Robert FPGA Zoom Spots also made this core, and there's so many visual enhancements to the PlayStation 1 hardware. You can get a better than real hardware experience out of this core. And if you send 240p direct video into RetroTink 4K, you're going to be scaling this to 4K on your television, and it's never going to look this good. DuckStation can definitely do 4K, but that software emulation, it is different, although I do think DuckStation is one of the best emulators of all time as well. But again, with the data coming over, so much of this is just going to be taken care of for you. Now, some cores will need to be updated to receive extra information, and right now there's 3 cores on the RetroTink Discord that will take care of everything for you. But remember, this is still the first couple weeks of anything like this being possible. We'll see here we can play around with the scan lines and everything else as well, but there is a ton of fun to be had. Now let's move over to the Neo Geo AES and MVS, my favorite 2D console of all time. You will see here again, there are black bars on the top and the bottom, but that is giving us every single little bit of video detail. The aspect ratio is correct. This is what it should look like. Now I will scale this again in just a moment, but I wanted to show you what it looks like when I capture it versus what it looks like when I actually broadcast it to you. And if you were to use auto crop from here, you're going to start losing data on the left and right hand side of the screens unless you do it yourself, but I prefer to leave it just as you see it right now. This is what happens when I scale it in post. You're not losing any information whatsoever. It's XY constrained and sent through Superscaler, which is just another way on my end to scale an image that has nothing to do with the RetroTink, but is the same concept. But as we move back over to the normal source, this is just a spectacular image. From the colors to the resolution to everything else, this looks absolutely incredible, but I do think that it does benefit from a little bit of a scan line. Now the first scan line here, exponential, is going to soften things up a bit, and I don't actually like softening my filters. I like Super Gaussian or Gaussian. Those are keeping the image sharper while still giving me those same scan lines. But the best part is you can play around and do whatever you want. Whatever looks good to you is going to be the correct answer. This is not a right or wrong situation. This is more creating a vibe for you to enjoy. But moving over to Power Instinct Matra Melee, my favorite Neo Geo game of all time. I'm not saying it's the best, I'm just saying it's my favorite. This looks absolutely phenomenal. I played so much of this game on MiSTer FPGA. I own an original AES cart that I play on my PVM. I played this game more than any other Neo Geo game in my collection, and I can tell you right now, the colors, the reproduction, the image, everything here is incredible. And because the RetroTink is such a low latency device, I'm able to play all of these Neo Geo games exactly like I'd expect them to, whether I was using the MiSTer FPGA scaler or bypassing it with 240p video and using the RetroTink scaler instead. It is amazing. If you drop any inputs, if you have any issues, it's because you missed your button commands and not because of any sort of latency. And this game has such a hilarious sense of humor as well. If you've never played it, I can't recommend you check it out enough. Let's move over to the work in progress Sega Saturn core from SRG 320, because not only do I love this core, I love the Sega Saturn hardware, and I think it has the best 240p RGB out of any console in original hardware format. Now this is not scaled whatsoever. You're going to see that there are black bars on the top and bottom of the image. But when we get into the gameplay, it's also going to be not scaled, a 1.0 to 1.0 ratio on the X and Y coordinates, but it is going to fill the screen. That is just sometimes how the hardware worked and the video signals that come out. So when you see something like this, that is intentional, and if you actually scaled this off a real Sega Saturn, you would see a very similar result. But again, over 240p, this just looks outstanding scaled to 4K. The image is clean, the motion is great, everything is just working so well. And that's the nice thing between the MiSTer FPGA and the RetroTink 4K. With the new unstable main, with the data coming over the analog signal in direct video, and with the RetroTink 4K actually ingesting that data and doing a lot of the work for you, you can basically just sit back and enjoy your game knowing you're getting almost the best out of what is possible here. You can still throw up scan lines, aperture mask, anything else you want, but you will know that when you put these two things together, 99% of the work has already been done for you. And I'm sure as the months go on, it's going to get even better, because RetroTink 4K barely even existed a month ago, and the SRG 320 Sega Saturn core is still a work in development. But if we throw some scan lines on here again, you're going to see that it changes the image ever so slightly, and again, I think this looks really nice. These scan lines in 4K on RetroTink over Sega Saturn and a lot of the MiSTer FPGA cores are just a very nice look, but the best part is, with all of the versatility between MiSTer and RetroTink 4K, you can craft an image however you want. Don't let anyone tell you what you want to do is wrong. So long as it looks good to you and you're happy, I am happy, and I agree with your choices. Because there is the tendency to pixel peep and try to pick absolutely everything apart when it comes to what your video should look like. This is subjective. You get to describe and decide the vibe you want to have, and you go from there. But let's take a look at Super Nintendo, because this is another amazing 2D console. I don't need to tell you that. And something like Yoshi's Island here, it just looks incredible as well scaled to 4K. And that is what I'm finding across the entirety of these tests. Of course, I'm not going to test every single console, handheld, and arcade core there is. If you want to see different things, leave me a comment down below and maybe I'll get around to them. But I just wanted to take a look at some of the games that I'm so infinitely familiar with that I would know if anything was off. My wife and I played this game pretty much every 24 months together. I probably played Yoshi's Island a dozen times in my life since it released. And here again, it just looks absolutely amazing. And those Super Gaussian scan lines are kind of turning out to be my favorite. They just give the image a look that I appreciate. Now do remember with YouTube compression that a lot of what I see in Resolve with the full fat files is going to be slightly different than what you see when it's been compressed to hell, even if you're running it at 4K 60. You really need to see this running on a television in front of you to understand exactly what it is I see, but you're probably getting like 90-95% of the effect because I run these videos at a bitrate that is substantially higher than it needs to be, but allows me to keep a little bit more detail in the capture. Or something like Mega Man X here, when all of this lighting condition changes from dark to light, again, it just looks absolutely insane with this combination. MiSTer FPGA Direct Video to RetroTink 4K is probably going to be how I play all of my MiSTer FPGA moving forward unless I'm on my 20-inch Sony PVM in my studio. This is just great, and it's doing such a better job than my television is of scaling it to 4K, and of course my television has no scanline feature whatsoever, although that would be amazing if a television manufacturer started to put FPGA chips in the TVs to play cores and have filters. In some bizarre alternate universe, that has definitely happened, but in this one, you have to rely on something like RetroTink 4K. But the great thing is the RetroTink 4K does such an amazing job at scaling this image that it is just your best friend when it comes to it. Now I understand that I'm putting a very expensive device into the back of an even more expensive device, and this is definitely something that not everyone is going to get into. But if you have a RetroTink 4K and you have a MiSTer FPGA, I can't recommend enough you get a DAC, a digital to analog converter, so you can do this exact same thing too. Let's move over to the arcade side with Wickerwaka's IREM M92 core and Ninja Baseball Batman. This is another absolutely insane game with such great visuals and really fun colors. And this was probably my favorite thing to actually see run in 4K. All of the artwork that IREM did for this game, with the core being spectacular and better than MAME, coming across the RetroTink 4K, of all the images I saw, this was the one that made me the happiest. Those baseballs, the green color there, everything here is just the best I've ever seen this game before. Whether I was playing it on MiSTer FPGA and letting my television do the final 4K scale or not, it just looks better here than I have ever seen. And if you've never played this game before, I can't recommend it enough. Not only is it an awesome beat 'em up, it's one of the weirdest games out there, so definitely check it out. That has nothing to do with scaling to 4K, but it is just my recommendation. But this image here on the RetroTink 4K captured into my Elgato 4K capture card is just pristine. I can't see a single thing in anything here that I would do any differently. Even that dithering pattern in the background giving you that sky, you can see every single pixel. They are super clear and precise. This is an 11 out of 10 image, and I just think these two things go so well together. There's absolutely no improvement I could ask for here on Ninja Baseball Batman. It is just perfect. Now going over the Capcom CPS2, this is one that I had a little bit of an issue with, and I had somebody else test this and they had the same issue. This actually seems to be something in the core when it's going over direct video, and that is the thing. Some cores are going to have to be slightly changed to take advantage of everything going on here. It seems, at least on the Capcom CPS2, I'm losing a little bit of data to the left and the right. Those character portraits should have information to the left and right of them, and the level 1 at the bottom, there should be pixels there as well. I tried to play around with the decimation, but I could never recapture all of this. Now I did take a look over analog video on my analog IO board, and I didn't have that issue at all, so it seems to be something that's happening only on direct video. And as far as the Sharp X68000 core is concerned, I know a lot of people are going to ask about that, because real Sharp X68000 works on the RetroTink 4K, but in core, and because this is not a finalized core yet, it is doing something ever so slightly weird. You're going to see here right off the top, it is going to be a very squashed image, the same thing we saw with Tobey Polystars when I first captured that on my RetroTink 4K review. If we go in and play around with the settings, we can get this almost close to perfect. If we use auto crop to 4:3, we're going to see that we get basically almost everything back and the image starts to look normal. But there is this shimmering and kind of waviness not only to the on-screen display, but as well as all of the art and everything else being displayed in the background. In this instance, a DOS prompt, or more like a human 68K prompt for being super official. You can play around with the video frequency, original to 60 Hz, and do anything else you want, but nothing was able to get that slight shimmer out of this. And I talked to a few people in the background, it is just because the core needs to be updated. So sometimes if you see something slightly weird, especially on a core that uses a strange refresh rate that is not a finished core, just be aware that is because not every single thing on MiSTer FPGA is 100% done. but I would say if you don't stare too closely, you might not even notice this happening. It's a very subtle effect, and the fact that this is picking up x68000 alone is incredible. But that's the current situation with direct video over 240p on MiSTer FPGA and into the RetroTink 4K. It does like 98% of the work for you, and you just get to do a few things in the background. But honestly, fiddling around is half the fun of playing with anything like this, but it is so impressive we can do this all on MiSTer FPGA into RetroTink. It's a match made in heaven. It is not a cheap one, but I think it's one that's very worth it. Short of that, if you want any other RetroTink videos, leave me a comment down below, but I will see you next time. Go play some MiSTer. Bye-bye.